Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to ask everybody to mute themselves as you enter the room and just give it a couple more minutes as we wait for all the participants. Amazing. Just another couple seconds here, folks. All right, I think we're ready to get started. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all having a fantastic day. And welcome to our second part in this series, which is bringing a neuro-inclusive lens to housing. We are joined again by our lovely speakers, Margaret and Mike. And My name's Nathika. As usual, you may already know me by now, but I'm the education programmer here at BCNPHA. And it's my honor to welcome you all on behalf of our organization. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded Coast Salish territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. Our work at BCNPHA, it takes place across the ancestral and unceded territories of about 198 distinct First Nations in British Columbia. We recognize their enduring presence and resilience in these lands and express our gratitude for the opportunity to live, learn, and work here. And we pay our respects to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous peoples joining us today. I also welcome everybody to engage in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. Beyond that, please do note that today's session is being recorded and we will be sending a copy of this recording to everybody via email within a week after the webinar concludes. And if you need any support throughout the session, please feel free to let us know in the chat and we'll do our best to help you out. And you're also encouraged to participate however it best suits you. So whether it's through the chat or by raising your hand and asking a question to our speakers, both work fantastically. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Margaret and Mike for today's presentation.
Thank you. And I'm just gonna share my screen here and make sure I can still see some faces. Excellent. Okay, yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the second part of our three-part webinar on bringing a neuroinclusive lens to housing. So in this webinar, we'll be exploring the building blocks of community-informed housing, and we aim to give you some strategies, some thoughts, and considerations about how to incorporate community voice into your projects or your organizations. Margaret and myself are part of Neuroinclusivity in Housing, which is a project at the Accessibility Institute at Carleton University. And I'll pass it over to Margaret to start us off.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Natika, for your warm welcome. As a team, we are committed to making housing more equitable and welcoming for autistic and neurodivergent people. And we recognize the importance of acknowledging the land that our work takes place. So our work spans across Turtle Island, and I acknowledge my position here as a settler. We intentionally and thoughtfully ground our efforts within the land that is now known as Canada, and offer deep gratitude to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities whose territories we now occupy. As we gather today at Carleton University, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Land acknowledgements, we acknowledge, are only a starting point, and we recognize that it's our responsibility to actively work towards dismantling colonialism and white supremacy. And we commit to ongoing learning and meaningful action to address lasting impacts of colonialism in Canada. as we discuss the value of lived experience and expertise today. We also acknowledge the wisdom of Indigenous communities across these lands who have long upheld the importance of oral history in sharing knowledge and shaping community. So our work on neuroinclusivity in housing, we strive to honor these teachings as we advocate for inclusive and accessible housing solutions. Mike, could you please switch the slide? Thank you. So hi, everyone. My name is Margaret Jans van Rensburg, and I'm a community outreach liaison for the Neuroinclusivity in Housing Project. I'm also a PhD candidate in the School of Social Work at Carleton University and a registered social worker. And most of my research and professional work is around supporting autistic adult mental health, well-being, and inclusion. And I'm committed to applying a neurodivergent lens in both research and practice. My role in the Neuroinclusivity and Housing Project is really to try and bring community voice into our project. As a neurodivergent person, I'm excited to be here today and part of our important conversation on neuroinclusive housing and to talk about how we try to bring in community perspective into work and how you can apply this into your own work. We'd like to know more about you as well, so please write into the chat who you are, where you are tuning into this webinar from, and whether you would rather be a fish or a bird. So I don't want to bias any of your answers, so I'll reveal my answer at the end of the session, but I'll ask Mike to introduce himself and let us know whether he would like to be a fish or a bird.
Thanks, Margaret. I always love your icebreakers. I've been thinking about this for the past 10 minutes, probably thinking about it a little too long. I think that I would like to be a fish, and because I actually would really like to know how to swim better, and I figured that's the best way to get to know how to swim better. So I'd like to be a fish and travel the world as a fish. My name is Mike Chong, and I am the knowledge mobilization lead for our project. We do have additional team members that are listed on the screen there. Boris and Tara are project leads, Katie, our project manager, Roxanne, our research lead, and Taylor, our research assistant. And I'll also share a bit about myself. I go by the pronouns he and him, and I'm a little tiny black box in your on your screen, but I am in my 30s. I have short black hair and I wear dark rimmed glasses. And today I'm wearing a light gray sweater. My background is in healthcare, in educational research, and I have a bit of a teaching background as well. So in our project, I organize, prepare, and share our learnings and research broadly in different ways, online, in person, and including in events like this. So for our agenda, today we'll start with a quick review of what we talked about in our first session to give context for our discussion today in case you missed that first session. Then we'll jump right into the importance of lived experience and why we want to bring it into nonprofit housing. We'll also have a reflection on what lived experience expertise is. We'll share how we, as a project, as a team, are bringing in lived experience into our work. We've broken that down into 3 phases we're calling setting the foundation, meaningful involvement, and ensuring impact. After, we'll give some ideas on how you might do it, share our key takeaways, have a Q&A, and have info about our next session. So first off, last week we gave a brief description of our project, so I'll go through this quickly again. As I mentioned, we are Neuroinclusivity in Housing. We are a collaboration with the Seneve Family Foundation, and our objective is to facilitate knowledge exchange and conduct applied research to move neuroinclusive housing solutions forward. Last week we talked about knowledge exchange through sharing good practices that are happening across Canada, bringing together resources and tools that we curate from Canadian and international sources that help people take a neuroinclusive lens to housing. We also actively connect people with all sorts of roles across the housing ecosystem, from service providers, housing providers, architects, designers, you name it. We conduct applied research to look for solutions that correspond to elements of successful housing, which we shared. For example, ensuring that there is self-determination, there's community and social connections, there's adequate medical and mental health. And of course, we want to provide some guidance of adapting these solutions that we find to housing initiatives. We then shared last week quite a bit of terminology, starting with neurodiversity and neurodivergence and neuroinclusion. So neurodiversity as the umbrella term encompassing the human cognitive experience, neurodivergence, meaning to have a consistent neurocognitive difference, a natural way of thinking that comes with strengths and challenges, and sharing about neuroinclusion, the idea of creating systems and spaces that take into account neurodiversity and neurodivergence. We presented language differences and that people have preferences, given the example of person first language, which would be saying people with disabilities, and identity first language, which would be saying disabled people. We landed on what's important is asking people and respecting their language choices. We discussed the unique housing needs of neurodivergent people, such as sensory considerations and community needs, and of course, recognizing that there are inequities in housing. We talked about building on elements for successful housing brought from a Housing Through an Autism Lens Solutions Lab that was a project a few years ago, and recognizing that housing is more than bricks and mortar. And finally, leading into the need to work with and connect with many different roles in the housing ecosystem, and that working together with a shared understanding and neuroinclusive lens can be quite powerful in improving housing. So that's a quick recap, and I will pass it over to Margaret to talk about how we get that shared lens, starting with the importance of lived experience.
Thank you, Mike. So lived experience refers to personal direct experiences with a personal issue, system, or identity. This experience is so valuable because it provides insights that professionals and academics alone cannot fully capture. In social work and in community-based research, lived experience is increasingly recognized as essential for shaping practice, education, and research. And while lived experience is widely discussed, it often remains an ambiguous concept. This makes its integration into formal knowledge structures really complicated. So without clear definitions and frameworks, there's really a risk of tokenism. This is where lived experience is acknowledged, but it's not meaningfully embedded into decision-making or policy development. So to move beyond symbolic inclusion or tokenism, we need to be dedicated and create dedicated resources to bring in community voice and build community capacity. Lived experience expertise is most impactful when those with direct experience are not just consulted, but are actively involved in leadership, research, and program development. This requires intentional structures that support communities in contributing to meaningful and sustainable ways. So the diagram on the slide visually represents how lived experience is shaped by multiple interconnected factors. So there's an orange kind of circle, and there are 8 different circles around it. So at the center, the core bubble is labeled lived experiences, surrounded by 8 smaller bubbles that highlight the different dimensions. So lived experience extends beyond personal narratives to include training, emotional responses, interventions, and reflections, all of which contribute to how individuals navigate systems and challenges. Factors like medical and psychiatric interventions, coping strategies, and perceptions of others can make lived experience a rich and essential source of knowledge. So by recognizing diverse dimensions, we can move beyond tokenistic inclusion and ensure that lived experience expertise is meaningfully embedded in research, practice, and policy development. So in housing, recognizing lived experience requires intentional investment. This is through compensation, accessible engagement strategies, and long-term partnerships. So through this webinar, we hope to talk to you a little bit more about how we can ensure that lived experience is not just heard, but it actively shapes the work that we do. Next slide, please. So lived experience expertise is more it's about more than just having personal experiences. It's about how these experiences shape our understanding and allow us to see things from perspectives that others may not have considered. Often, lived experience provides us with unique insights that professional training alone cannot offer. So take a moment to think about a time when you had a personal experience that gave you insight into something that others may not have fully understood. Maybe it was navigating a system, facing a challenge, or advocating for yourself or someone else. How did that experience shape the way that you see the world? Did it change how you approach certain situations or how you interact with others? Next slide, please, Mike. So on this slide, I have an example from my own experience. My lived experience brought me into the work that I do. I was a participant in research, and this gave me insight into how participants in research often don't know the reasons of research or the results of the research that they partake in. When we recognize the lived experience as expertise, we create space for people to share knowledge so that they can improve services, policies, and community initiatives. So in the next section, we'll explore how we can intentionally bring in lived experience expertise to make housing solutions and community work more impactful and inclusive. Next slide, please. So lived experience expertise, like we reviewed before, is more than just having personal experience. It's about taking that experience and changing it into knowledge that benefits a broader community. This means moving beyond individual perspectives, analyzing, reflecting, and applying lived experience in ways that create meaningful change. So we can break this process down into three components. And we have a diagram, I guess it's called a Venn diagram on the slide to show this. So reflection is in one circle, application is in another circle, and analysis is in the third circle. So when we talk about reflection, we mean reflecting on personal experiences and identifying key issues. When we talk about analysis, this is really understanding patterns, systemic issues, and broader implications in lived experience. Finally, in application, this is when we use lived experience knowledge to influence policy, programs, and advocacy efforts. So some examples of lived experience expertise in action could be when an autistic tenant advocates for accessible housing policies. A formerly unhoused person advises a shelter on how to improve supportive programming, or if a disability advocate is working on city zoning and transportation laws to create more accessible communities. Lived experience expertise is an essential part of decision-making, policy, and program design, but it needs to be recognized, valued, and compensated accordingly. Next slide, please. So why bring in lived experience? It's essential because it ensures policies, programs, and services are rooted in real needs rather than assumptions. Without the perspectives of those who are directly impacted by policies, programs, and services, we risk designing systems that exclude, misunderstand, or even harm the communities that we try to help. There are four key reasons why lived experience should be integrated. And we have a diagram on the slide. The first box on the diagram says prevent harmful assumptions. So this first key reason is really around professionals and policymakers may unintentionally make decisions based on stereotypes or incomplete information. So if we include lived experience, this can help to correct any stereotypes or incomplete information or assumptions that we might have when we are informing the work that we do. The second reason is that we can create effective and equitable programs and policies. So when those with lived experience help to shape our solutions, outcomes can be more relevant, sustainable, and impactful for people. The third reason is really to encourage participatory decision making. This upholds a co-production model, and this practice demands that communities have a say in decisions that affect them rather than being passive recipients of services. So if you've ever heard the saying, nothing about us without us, this is really a way to encourage that decision making in a participatory way. The fourth reason is it helps us to identify gaps that we might overlook as professionals. So those with lived experience navigate systems daily and can help point out flaws, barriers, and solutions that others may miss. So by valuing lived experience as expertise, we move toward a more just, inclusive, and responsive approach in housing, social services, and policy. Next slide, please. So we have a poll here. Have you or your organization engaged with lived experience expertise? So most of you have. We have 64% saying yes, 14% saying no, and 21 who are unsure or maybe. What lived experiences are important for your organization to consider? You can write in the chat or you can talk out loud.
So while you're typing into the chat, I think back to kind of an example in my past work, and the sort of clearest one for me engaging with lived experience was when I used to work as a pharmacist, and one of the things that we did was to go into community and engage with the people that we served. So, for example, connecting with people in their homes, like if they were in retirement homes, or going to community centers and meeting with the community there. And so there's a direct, I guess, connection to housing as well, despite being healthcare focused, because for us it wasn't, as simple as giving medication and people using it. Um, there's an understanding that the physical space, their living space, impacts their health and their relationship with medications. So it was really important for us to understand people's experience with medications, particularly when they had many ones to juggle. And I think that without that understanding and connection, we really wouldn't be in a position to support people's health and improve health outcomes that way. And thank you, CARE's Support Society there in program development and policy creation. Danielle as well, program policy development and engage platform for employees, and Natika as well, with accessibility advocates when designing in-person events or conferences. So I'll ask you to think for a minute again. Think about a time when a decision was made that impacted your life, but you weren't consulted. And I'll say as an adult, so not like a parent or teacher when you were very young. And could be housing, could be something else. I won't ask you to share this, but think about how did that feel? Uh, was it frustrating? Were you disappointed? Did it make you feel like your knowledge or your experiences were not valued? Was the decision ending up addressing something that you didn't think was a priority? And I guess ultimately, did the result turn out to not meet your particular needs? So what we've learned by engaging with community is that when decisions are made without consultation, it can lead to feelings of frustration, of exclusion, and disempowerment. And I know I came about this from a negative perspective, but we can turn it around into something more positive and think about what happens when you are consulted. And I think regardless of the outcome, you can know that your insights were part of it, that you were part of the decision making. So when decisions are made with meaningful consultation, they often lead to empowerment, ownership of the decision, and better outcomes. Um, we spend a lot of time talking about this because, as simple as it sounds, we recognize that it's often not done when we consider neuro-inclusive nonprofit housing. Sometimes organizations or people in general wonder why housing doesn't work for the people they are supporting, and this is part of it. So we think that it is ethical and necessary for effective decision making and not just a formality. And I'll give one more example. If you imagine a city has the really good idea to develop an accessible housing policy, it reviews past policies. It may go to other cities and learn what's happening. It may consult with accessibility experts. But if it doesn't connect with um, residents, and for example, disabled residents, it risks making design flaws that don't really meet real accessibility needs. Like if you zone an area for affordable and accessible housing, but um, you don't have zoning for retail grocery that can be accessed without a vehicle. And then you eventually find out later on that people have a difficult time getting food, right? And so I think um, that's why all of this is really important. So in our project, we incorporate community voice and experience. One of the ways is having neurodivergent team members. But today, we're really going to explore how we formed and engaged our neurodivergent advisory group. So our advisory group consists of autistic and neurodivergent members who are interested in enhancing housing solutions. In our project, they review outputs, identify research priorities, they assist with knowledge mobilization, and they will reflect on research outputs, and that's in the diagram on the right. We've talked about why it's important in general, but for our project specifically, we want to make sure that the housing solutions, the applied research and the knowledge mobilization that we do is reflected in lived experience. And for for us, very importantly, this is not a consultation only kind of relationship. It is a continuous engagement. And I'll hand it back over to Margaret.
Thank you, Mike. So, as Mike introduced you, we did bring our bring in lived experience expertise through the neurodivergent advisory group. And our approach was really designed to ensure that the engagement was intentional, meaningful, and impactful. We did this through a three-phase process, and on the screen, there's an arrow and three different bubbles. The first step, which is in the first bubble, says setting the foundation. So this was really about creating the right conditions for involvement. We didn't just want to simply invite people to the table. We wanted them to feel valued and supported. This meant providing clear expectations about roles, responsibilities, and decision-making power, ensuring accessibility through flexible participation options, and compensating members for their time and expertise. By setting the strong foundation, we ensured that participation wasn't just symbolic, it was integral to our project. Once our foundation was in place, we focused on making participation meaningful. This step was about fostering true engagement through ongoing dialogue and collaboration. We created a space where advisory members had influence in shaping our work. This virtual space was a place where we could prioritize multiple communication methods and ensure different ways to participate, embedding lived experience expertise into decision-making processes. By doing this, we moved beyond consultation to ensure that those with lived experiences actively contributed to our project's direction. In our final phase, ensuring impact, we focused on making sure that the input led to changes in our project. So too often, lived experience contributions are gathered but not acted upon. We continue to hold ourselves accountable to our advisory group by demonstrating how their insights shape our work and by advocating for the integration of lived experience beyond the project's immediate scope. This process isn't just about improving our initiative, it's about long-term positive change for people who shared their expertise. So by following this three-phase process, we've aimed to move beyond tokenism towards meaningful inclusion. And now I'm going to walk you through each phase, giving you different examples of how we did these. Next slide. So in the first step, setting the foundation, we really focused on creating those right conditions for meaningful involvement. So before engaging with the community, we focused on three key elements to set the foundation for meaningful participation. And these are outlined on the slide that you can see. So the first was having a dedicated facilitator to make sure that the community group knew who to contact. So this community representative was able to lead the engagement to foster authenticity and trust. As the community outreach liaison, I served as this facilitator, and I tried to ensure that the advisory committee members had a consistent point of contact so that they knew who to reach out to directly. The second was to think about representation. So when we formed the group, we intentionally considered intersectionality, geography, and the diverse lived experiences of different members to make sure that there was a range of different perspectives. We understand that having a truly representative advisory group is very difficult. And so to try and do this, we thought of going beyond descriptive representation and including the perspectives of individuals who felt that they had the capacity to represent others within their scope. The third was to have clear communication. Participants received pre-meeting materials, clear expectations, and transparent discussions about compensation. This helped to set the stage for a collaborative and respectful engagement where advisory members could focus on sharing their expertise without uncertainty or confusion. Beyond these key elements, we also prioritized accessibility by offering flexible meeting times, multiple ways to participate, and accommodations for sensory and communication needs. Establishing these practices early on reinforced that lived experience expertise is just as valuable as professional expertise. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we want to show you an example of how we focus on laying this groundwork for meaningful and accessible consultation. So this example is of a detailed pre-session guidance document to ensure that the participants felt informed and prepared. So this included things like the objectives of the session so that people knew and understood the purpose and focus of the discussion, the logistics of the session, so the meeting format, accessibility options, and ways to participate, as well as technological needs, and what to expect. So ensuring that everyone had the necessary contexts and skills to feel comfortable engaging in the conversation. Providing this information in advance helped to create a more inclusive and accessible environment while allowing participants to engage on their own terms and contribute in a meaningful way to them. By preparing thoroughly, we reinforced that community voices are valued and that participation in these sessions are not just a formality, but are a crucial and respected part of the process. Next slide, please. Once the foundation was in place, we really focused on making this participation meaningful. So during engagements, we focused on meaningful involvement by ensuring that participation was flexible, psychologically safe, and participant-led. This flexible participation allowed for contributions in writing, verbally, or asynchronous means to accommodate different communication preferences. We recognize that accessibility is really important in ensuring that different perspectives are acknowledged, and so we provided different ways for people to engage based on their needs and their comfort levels. We also wanted to establish psychological safety. So we established group agreements and confidentiality measures and multiple communication options so that participants felt secure in sharing their insights. It was essential that advisory members also felt that their perspectives were respected and valued, and that they wouldn't face judgment or dismissal in expressing their experiences. We also emphasize the importance of letting the conversation flow. So we did share an agenda in our foundation in that instructions and guidance document. But rather than rigidly sticking to this agenda, we followed participants' lead, allowing space for organic discussions and deeper engagement. And this approach really made sure that we were listening to what mattered most to the advisory group rather than imposing our own predefined priorities. So beyond these core principles, we really thought about collaborative decision making. Advisory group members weren't just asked for feedback. They were actively involved in shaping recommendations and the activities that we had in our sessions. We honored different communication styles and recognized that not everybody expresses ideas in the same way or in the same time frames. So while we did have community meetings, we acknowledged that there was many different ways that or ideas that could pop up later, and we took those experiences into consideration if people followed up by email or by an anonymous survey. So by prioritizing this accessibility and safety and responsiveness, we really tried to create an environment where lived experience could be shared and valued. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we have an example of how we made this space during the consultation. So we incorporated flexible and anonymous participation methods that accommodated diverse needs. So not everybody is comfortable sharing their thoughts in the moment, and traditional meeting formats can also create barriers to participation. So people might talk over each other or feel like they can't contribute something during a traditional meeting. So to address this, we used an anonymous follow-up survey, allowing participants extra time to really process discussions and to contribute confidentially. This was especially important for those who preferred to reflect before sharing feedback, ensuring their voices were still understood and heard without the pressure of speaking in real time. We also provided options for cameras off and chat participation during our online meetings that recognized that verbal engagement isn't always accessible or comfortable for everybody. By offering these multiple ways to contribute, people had the ability to engage in their own comfort levels without feeling excluded. These strategies ensured that everybody had a voice, even if they preferred to contribute in different ways. This really tried to uphold our flexible and psychological safety of the members to create an environment where lived experience could be shared and valued equally. Next slide, please. So on our last the last part of our three-phase process is really about ensuring impact after engagements. And in this final phase, we really focused on making sure that the input was integrated into our project and that we displayed how we did this to our community members. This is because too often lived experience contributions are gathered on but never acted upon, and this can be discouraging and lead to disengagement. It is also because, based on my own lived experience of not knowing what the impact of being a research participant was. So, to prevent this, we prioritized accountability and transparency and really tried to ensure that advisory members could understand and see how their insights were directly shaping our work. We followed up with notes and actions, clearly communicating how their contributions were influencing our project scope. Keeping the door open for ongoing feedback and future participation was also essential in maintaining trust and reinforcing that their expertise was valued beyond a single consultation. We worked to measure and acknowledge impact by using "you said, we did" reports. And on the next slide, I have an example of that. These really documented the concrete ways that lived experience shaped our recommendations, policies, and next steps. So by advocating for the long-term integration of lived experience expertise, we really are trying to make sure that advisory members are not just consulted on for this project, but are part of a larger movement towards meaningful inclusion. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we have a picture of our example of the "you said, we did" visual, which really highlights what was implemented and why. So this was a way that we ensured accountability and acknowledged the impact of people's contributions, which directly highlights what was implemented based on community input and explains why certain decisions were made. This helped advisory members to see the direct impact of their contributions and really tried to reinforce trust in the process. We also made sure that our advisory group remained ongoing. So we didn't just gather input at one point. We maintained continuous engagement, integrating their lived experience into decision making at multiple stages. Beyond these strategies, we were committed to following up with notes and actions after each engagement. And these practices try to reinforce trust and demonstrate that contributions were valued and acted upon. Next slide, please. So bringing in lived experience expertise really strengthens housing by ensuring that policies and programs can reflect the real needs rather than assumptions of individuals. When people with lived experience of housing challenges are involved in decision making, solutions become more equitable, accessible, and effective. So to reflect on this, type into the chat, who has lived experience expertise in your work? This could include people like tenants, service users, frontline workers, caregivers, family members, or grassroots organizers. These individuals bring essential insights to professionals and policymakers that we might traditionally overlook. So I see in the chat, all are involved. So we also want to know how you might think about whose expertise is missing. This might be harder to think about. So conducting targeted outreach, engaging with diverse networks, and creating accessible consultation opportunities that can help uncover missing voices. By intentionally centering lived experience in housing discussions, we can move towards more inclusive and just housing solutions. Next slide, please. And thank you everybody for writing in the chat who has lived experience expertise. So lived experience can be applied at multiple levels with nonprofit housing. And we like to think about this using ecological systems theory, which helps us to understand the different levels of influence that can shape an individual's experience. So on the slide, there is kind of like a target, I'll call it, that shows 3 circles, and in the middle there is the micro level, which is individual and personal, the meso level, which is organizational, and the external factors, which are the macro level, the structural, policy, and advocacy factors. So at the micro level, this individual and personal level, which includes direct experiences and decision-making, a person-centered approach can ensure that tenants and service users have agency and influence over their housing experiences. This means moving beyond simply providing services to empower people to shape their living conditions and supports. An example of this is a tenant co-leads a community housing board. Next slide, please. At the organizational level or the meso level, nonprofit housing organizations really do play a crucial role in bridging lived experience with systemic change. This level focuses on how organizations structure their policies, programs, and decision-making to ensure that tenant and community voices are embedded into housing initiatives. Establishing advisory committees made up of lived experience experts is one way to integrate these voices into program design, service delivery, and decision-making. These committees can help bridge gaps between policy and real-world needs, ensuring that housing services remain responsive and effective. So an example that we have is that a housing organization has lived experience expertise advisory committee. Another example could be frontline staff, housing staff receive neurodiversity training informed by lived experience to help improve services and support for autistic and neurodivergent tenants. These efforts can help to ensure that lived experience is not just heard, but it actively influences organizational policies and practices. Next slide, please. So in the macro level, the structural policy and advocacy level, systemic forces such as housing policies, funding structures, and broader social attitudes, which sometimes feel completely out of our control, can determine the accessibility and availability of housing for neurodivergent and autistic people. Advocacy at this level can ensure that lived experience informs systemic change, leading to more inclusive policies, funding models, and research priorities. When people with lived experience participate in these policy reforms, funding decisions, and research, housing can become more equitable and responsive to community needs. So we have an example on the slide that says the concerns of your community members are included in a national housing policy. Another example could be a lived experience expert is invited to speak at government housing consultation, informing the development of tenant protections. So by integrating lived experience across these different levels, so in the individual and personal, the organizational, and the structural policy and advocacy levels, we can ensure that neurodivergent and autistic people are not just active or not just passive recipients of housing services, but they're active people in shaping their housing environments, organizations, and policies. This approach can move us towards a more inclusive and equitable and sustainable housing solution. Next slide.
Thanks, Margaret. I want to make sure we leave some time for questions. So to just kind of summarize our key takeaways, we really want to express that community-informed housing can take many, many forms. And whether, as Margaret talked about, whether you're in the micro, the macro circles of influence, you can do it. And for us, it's really ensuring people impacted by policies and services have a meaningful role in shaping those policies and services, and of course, housing. So I did this last week. I like to use quotes as a researcher. So an architect that we interviewed kind of displayed this. They said, whenever we make sure that we're engaged with not just the client groups, but for public facilities, actually engaging with the people who are running the programs, engaging with the people who are going to potentially live there to understand their lived experience. So as they're drawing up designs, they're going back and forth with not just the people building the building, but with the people that are going to be living there as well. And I got two more here for you. We spoke with a neurodivergent tenant who said, and they were welcoming and then showing me around, telling me about the safety of the community, the proximity to the healthcare system, things I needed to know, the information. All the questions that I had were answered by the community members and the landlord too. So this is at the micro level, that personal level impacting the person where a landlord and the community members take time to share important aspects about the community and the things that matter most to this tenant. And we spoke with a social worker who said, when I'm seeking materials, I try to seek them from neurodivergent people. So when I'm looking for materials, I look for things that have come from the community. So in supporting housing, an effort is made to find relevant community-informed materials. And in this specific example, it's part of the interactions and work with neurodivergent people. So extending that consultation and engagement piece into the materials around that direct the individual casework that this person is doing. And so to lay it all out, we have a few key points here, or process that can be broadly applied to other projects and organizations. So first, to define who has lived experience, expertise relevant to our work, then identify accessible and meaningful ways to engage them. And that often is mostly asking and providing options for participation. Then ensuring feedback is integrated into decision making with a clear recognition that lived experience is expertise and providing compensation. And lastly, really importantly, done it over and over again, but to have regular and ongoing engagement. So we'll bring these back next week. Go into question Q&As in the last 5-6 minutes or so, but I will move on to this last session slide. And our last session will be to take this process and do some practice with it. We'll do some reflection, ideation, some advocacy planning, We hope that you are available to attend our last session, and if so, we'll ask you to think about what is one step you can take to integrate lived experience into your work. And date and time is there, and uh, I think I has put in the link in the chat as well, so March 4th, 9:30 a.m. Pacific. Thank you. If you have questions, please go ahead. You can raise your hand in the or type it into the chat.
I guess I can ask a question, Mike, while people are typing in. I can see how you would bring in lived experience when it's a specific building or even a city, but how do you do it when your work spans across the whole province? Like if you're trying to make funding decisions across many communities?
Margaret, would you like to
Yeah, I can,
take a step?
and then
Okay,
I'll
sure,
pass it to you. I think it's
sure.
very it's it can be tricky, and there are many different consultation methods, and it's about choosing a method that is practical and meets the needs of say a funding body, as well as meets the needs as who is going to be impacted by that funding. So in the case of like housing funding, it's about doing that outreach and finding out what are the ways that these organizations or individuals are used to being consulted. What are ways that are manageable for being consulted? And so it's thinking about that and also thinking about who may be missing. And so when we're thinking about who may be missing from it, the different reasons for not being able to be part of a traditional consultation should be acknowledged. So something we thought about a lot with our neurodivergent and autistic advisory committee was the ability to be able to contribute um, during work hours. And so our sessions were actually on the weekend, and we put in many breaks during our sessions to be able to allow for that. We also thought about the financial situations that a lot of the people who we consulted with were in. And so we actually had quite a small advisory committee because we were committed to being able to give quite generous honorariums for our consultations. And that was actually a drawback, is that we couldn't consult with so many people because we were committed to making sure that we could include people who may not have been able to be consulted because there may have been financial reasons that they may have to miss work, or have children who need to take they need to have somebody look after. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that a little bit as well. When we think about at maybe like a provincial level or on a national level, we provide an example of like um, looking for people with uh, um, I'm going to say this wrong, but sort of like incorporating their intersectionality into our advisory group. Um, so trying to be as diverse as possible. So there's one way to do that. The other way, I think we talk about, having a advisory committee, but as an organization, if your scope is very large, like provincial, I think there's such good opportunity to partner and with other organizations, potentially an advocacy organization who already has an advisory group, and to tap into kind of getting that feedback. So it doesn't have to be your organization um, having an advisory committee yourself, but to connect with those that do in the communities that they're in. And I think that's a great way to go about. And along the way, you make some good networks and good connections.
Thank you. That answers my question.
Thank you.
I
Um,
also see there's another one by Rebecca. She's asking, can you provide us with with resources to look for neurodiversity training for our staff?
Thank you. And I did respond to that because I was unsure where you're located. So I do know in BC there is Canucks Autism. What I will say is about all sorts of diversity trainings. Um, and there are it's always worthwhile to look at many different resources. So we talked about neurodiversity last session, and we talked about how different people define it in different ways. And often there will be different communities who we talk to who will provide different kinds of training. And so it's about finding a good fit for your organization and what kind of training needs that you really have. And so there are lots of different resources. You can also look at our website, has many different resources.
and feel free to email us and if there's like specific things that you're looking for, we can help out and see what we can provide.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Margaret and Mike, for your time and your expertise, and to everybody engaging and asking questions. Again, we'll be sure to send you a recording if you joined in late, no problem. And hopefully, we'll see you again next week on March 4th. Till then, I hope everybody has a fantastic week ahead and take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye.